Hello everyone, welcome back to the Atomic Hobo. I'm Julie McDowell, and this week we're going to talk about the nuclear war film from the 60s called The War Game. It's about time we looked properly at The War Game because even though I'm a connoisseur of these things, I suppose you could say, even I don't give The War Game its due. I always think it's second best in terms of threads. Everyone who listens to this will know that I'm absolutely obsessed with threads. It was threads that prompted my whole obsession and interest in nuclear war. I saw it when I was 3. That's the impact it had on me. As a 3-year-old, that was me stamped and marked for life thanks to threads. So I always think of The War Game as second best, which is unfair. Threads is still the best film, the best nuclear film in my opinion, but that's not to say The War Game deserves to be not given proper attention. So I've decided to do a podcast on The War Game this particular week because it's recently been uploaded to the BBC Iplayer service. So it's freely available, at least for listeners in Britain. It's freely available at the moment for anyone who wants to watch it. It's been uploaded, I think, a couple of weeks ago, and it'll be available for a month, it says, so there might still be another few weeks if you want to watch it. So I would recommend, if you have access to iPlayer, get in about it and watch this brilliant film. And in this podcast I will talk briefly about the film. I don't want to just recite what's in the film because it's there for people to watch. I don't want to give spoilers, even though it isn't possible to give a spoiler really. There's a nuclear war, we all know how that ends. So we'll talk briefly about what the film does, play a few clips, but the main focus of the podcast will be on the huge controversy which arose surrounding The War Game. In brief, the BBC commissioned it. It was made by a fiery young director called Peter Watkins. They commissioned it, and when they saw the final cut, certain people in charge at the BBC were horrified and they banned it. So it couldn't be seen in Britain at all unless you're a member of a film club. It was shown in some film clubs. It was shown abroad, of course, in cinemas abroad. It went on to win an Oscar for Best Documentary, which proves how wrong the BBC were in banning it. It was a brilliant film which deserved to be seen. And the BBC didn't rectify the problem until the 80s. I think it was in 1985. It was finally broadcast on the BBC. So, huge controversy about that, whether they banned it because of Home Office pressure, or did they ban it because, the paternalistic BBC were worried about the welfare of the population. If we saw it, were we all going to have mass panics and suicides? So we'll look at that controversy, we'll look at what the critics said about the film, and we'll hopefully give it the attention it's due. I know that I always tend to think of it as second best, but recently, since it's been added to iPlayer, I've watched it another 3 times and realised, of course, it's not fair to call it second best, even though technically it is, because Threads is the greatest. Calling it second best isn't fair. It does deserve far more attention and far more respect. So let's look at the horrible 1960s horror of The War Game.
This family couldn't afford to build themselves a refuge. This could be the way the last 2 minutes of peace in Britain would look.
The War Game is like Threads, it's a drama documentary, so it has a very realistic style. And when Peter Jackson, the director, was researching the film, he stuck rigidly to reality by researching the effects of the firestorms in Hamburg, Dresden, Tokyo, for example. And a lot of the scenes in the film are taken directly from those Second World War events, such as the infamous scene in the film where we see a bucket of wedding rings sitting on the pavement. That was taken from Dresden, when they had piles and piles of corpses, which were obviously burned. There was no easy way to identify them. So one method was to look at the wedding rings on the finger, and obviously many of them were engraved with names and dates. So once the body was identified, the wedding ring was tossed in the bucket. So that's taken directly from reality. The film also borrows a lot from government civil defence plans, which, as we know from this podcast, are often ridiculous and absurd and would be useless in the face of a thermonuclear attack. So the film also quotes from these or references these and mocks them. And of course that's partly the reason we assume why the BBC, or at least powers in the Home Office, weren't happy with the film. It mocks, for example, the instruction to take your marriage certificates and bank books into the shelter with you. And it also pokes fun at the, if we can use the word fun in relation to the war game, it makes fun of the Women's Royal Voluntary Service. They were going to staff welfare centres after the nuclear war and be in charge of feeding the survivors. They, very optimistically, very hopefully, had proposed at one point to include very hearty menus. We can assume that after the nuclear war there'd be nothing but, if you were lucky, some powdered soup or a very thin stew thrown together from whatever irradiated vegetables or meats were still there. But the Women's Royal Voluntary Service had offered or suggested meals involving roast beef and Brussels sprouts, apple pie and custard. And of course we all know, especially after watching the war game, that this is not realistic in the slightest. So the film sticks to reality. It sticks to the reality of what happened in the firestorms of the Second World War, and it sticks to the reality of civil defence planning, and it shows really that these plans would be useless. But again, we know that already from this podcast. These plans were perhaps well-meaning. I'm not suggesting that anyone was trying to trick or fool the population. They were just a bit too optimistic, a bit too hopeful, or perhaps they were just thrown together because what the hell else are you supposed to do? The government demand that we plan for this. Okay, let's draw up a plan, even though we know it's not going to work. So the war game borrows from reality throughout the whole film, that drama documentary style. It's also narrated, sections of it are narrated by Michael Aspel, who obviously had a recognisable voice. So that gave it the feel that a newsreader was relaying the facts to us. So the film is hyper-realistic and therefore, of course, very, very brutal and very distressing. Speaking of the firestorms, let's play a clip from the film. And again, bear in mind that Peter Watkins did intense research, always sticking to the reality of what happened.
Charles Brooks, Chief Fire Officer of Chatham. Already 3 of his appliances have been smashed, gutted or overturned. Already 17 of his 60 firemen have been crushed, burnt or killed by flying debris. This is a firestorm. Within its center, the oxygen is being consumed in every cellar and every ground floor room, to be replaced by the gases of carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide and methane. Within its center, the temperature is rising to 800 degrees centigrade. These men are dying.
The film opens with rising international tensions, as Threads does. This time the trouble centres around Vietnam and Berlin. And then we see a doctor on his rounds, and whilst he's attending to his patient, the siren goes off. The action is all centred on Kent. A nuclear bomb is fired at Manston Airfield in Kent, but it overshoots the airfield and of course attacks the town. The film doesn't take place, of course, at Ground Zero, because there would be no film, there would be nothing happening there except ash. The film takes place on the outskirts of the attack, so we have the worst of both worlds. We have thousands of deads, but also thousands of appallingly scarred and wounded and psychologically traumatised survivors. And the camera at times it seems as if the camera is just wandering the streets and looking at a horror here, an atrocity there. Perhaps the viewer would be overwhelmed if it weren't for the very calm, realistic tone of it. There's no hysteria. We get the feeling that the cameraman is just slowly making his way through the streets, and the crew are there with him with their notepads saying, what's this? Sorry, excuse me, what's happened here? Can you tell me what's happening in that building? What are the policemen doing? Why are they shooting those people? So even though the scenes are of horror, there's a kind of detached tone, I feel, from the filmmaker himself. He's just saying, sit back and look at this. And we will just walk the streets and take it all in. Without hysteria, without cranking up the horror any further than it has to be. We are just here as cool, cold observers. And there are certain awful scenes in the film that will stick out. For me, they are when the hospitals, of course, are overwhelmed. Doctors run out of drugs, run out of staff, of course. There simply aren't enough doctors and nurses to treat all the people. And so some, of course, have to be abandoned to their fate. Some patients have to base or the tools or the medicine to treat them. And of course they're in agony from burns or terrible injuries or radiation sickness. So what do you do with them? Well, we see in this film the police are brought in to humanely execute them, to put them out of their suffering. And we see these worn and weary, exhausted policemen, and they're in probably the backyard of the hospital or something, and they're stepping over rubble, stepping over other bodies, and just pointing their little guns at people's heads. People are lying on the ground moaning and crying, and they just deliver a bullet to the head and put them out of their misery. We also see looters being executed, and a vicar delivers the Lord's Prayer and then steps away from them just before they're shot. And of course he says, forgive them, they know not what they do. They're looting because we assume they are starving. They're starving and they're desperate. Later in the film we go to a refugee camp, and the camera, again documentary style, asks some of the children, what do you want to do when you grow up?
These children are orphans of the attack. They were each asked what they now wanted to grow up to be.
I don't want to be nothing. Neither do I. I don't want to be nothing. Neither do I want to be nothing.
I don't want to be nothing. And it ends with them, again in the refugee camp. Christmas must have arrived. Not that we can tell, not that there's any sign of festivity or joy. Everyone looks as grey and as exhausted and as battered as they did the day before, and as they will the next day and the next day. Christmas isn't any different. But the Reverend, again at the front of the crowd, is playing Silent Night on a record player. And he's winding the record player, of course, with his finger. He's pulling the record round and round with his finger because, of course, there's no electricity. And the film just fades away to the sound of Silent Night. So let's look at the controversy surrounding the war game. Peter Watkins, the director, he joined the BBC and was very keen, very energetic, and he had made it known that he wanted to make a film about the reality of nuclear war. His bosses weren't too keen, so they gave him a commission instead to make a film about the Battle of Culloden, which I haven't seen, but it's very highly praised. They gave him that commission as a hope of keeping him quiet. Maybe he'll be satisfied if we give him this big meaty job to do instead. But no, he made Culloden, he made a great film out of it, and then he came back saying, right, come on, where's my nuclear war film? He wouldn't give up. He was set on making a film which would bring the reality of nuclear war to the population. Remember, this was in 1965, so there was still, from my research anyway, I believe there was still a big hangover in Britain from the Blitz. I think a lot of people were still thinking that another war, if it came, would just be like the Second World War, in that it wouldn't be Armageddon, it wouldn't be the end of the world. We'd be able to get through it as we did the last war, with, civil defence at home and Blitz spirit and looking after one another. It would be survivable, really. And Peter Watkins wanted to say, no, not necessarily. An all-out nuclear war could be the end of the world, could be beyond our imagination. It would be nothing like the Second World War. So he wanted to almost give a nudge or a kick to the to the population who were still in denial or in ignorance about the reality of nuclear weapons. So he was dead set on making such a film. And to the credit of the BBC, they eventually gave him the go-ahead. And the documents I've read about this suggest that he was given permission because this was by now mid-60s and the culture at the BBC was changing. We were getting a lot of satirical programming. Things were shaking up a bit at the old stuffy BBC. And of course we had the experimental BBC Two coming on board, so the culture was changing at the BBC. So Peter Watkins, I assume, arrived just at the right time and was able to make use of this changing culture. So they gave permission. The reading I've done suggests they gave permission reluctantly, but they said, okay, go ahead with it, but it mustn't pose a threat to national security. You know, it mustn't antagonise the government too much. It mustn't reveal any secrets about how we would handle nuclear war. The government weren't too happy about it. The Home Office in particular were kind of poking their nose in from the outset. What's this film all about? What's it going to do? What questions will we be asking? Even though of course the BBC is independent, the BBC and the government had worked closely of course during the Second World War, and arguably this close relationship continued when Britain was facing, you know, the communist threat instead of the Nazi threat. A paper I've read called The BBC, the State and the Cold War Culture, the Case of Television's The War Game, says that in the early Cold War at least, the BBC were still careful. They discouraged controversy, played down polemic and endorsed official doctrine on defence. And MI5 were also vetting BBC staff to root out any potential subversives. This paper also says that the BBC's nuclear coverage in the 40s and 50s had, quote, something of a tranquilising effect on the public. So it was into this tranquilised nuclear world of the BBC that Peter Watkins arrived, saying, right, let's shake things up, let's get a dose of reality involved. So he pitched his idea of a nuclear film, and due to the slowly changing BBC culture, it was given the go-ahead. Let me read you a quote from that same paper about BBC Cold War culture. The author is Tony Shaw, I should have said. I got it from the English Historical Review. It's taken from a letter that Peter Watkins wrote to Hugh Weldon, who was then head of BBC documentary programmes. And this was his pitch, basically, to be allowed to make a nuclear war film. He says, "We all of us know and accept the fact that nuclear warfare might be the outcome of present world politics. We all condone the presence of nuclear weapons, which could mean, in 1 hour, the death of 10 or 20 times the number of people assassinated during the Jewish pogroms. And yet, really and honestly, not one of us gives a blind nickel in thought to what, in effect, we might well be responsible for. Children covered in gaping third-degree burns, healthy men reduced to pus-oozing lumps, women turned sterile in a moment. I realise that if I say this during the running of the film, virtually the entire audience will reach for the off switch. No, the film will be impartial, journalistic, but because it will be taking place after the next World War has started, and because everything in it will be painfully recognisable as cogs in their everyday ordinary life, but subjected to the most hideous events conceivable, I hope that in this roundabout way I will make the point I want to. Why in hell's name, before it's too late, don't we kick ourselves in the pants and begin to behave like human beings?" So reluctantly, permission was given to make what became known as the War Game. Although Peter Watkins had to stress again and again, it will be impartial, we're going to have a journalistic approach, we're not going to be arguing a particular case, and the viewer can make their own mind up. So even though the BBC were a bit touchy about it, a bit unsure, they did give him a budget of £9,000, which was the second highest ever given for a BBC documentary film. So he began his research. He went to Berlin. He surveyed old folks' homes and schools. He sent questionnaires to psychiatrists, the fire service, philosophers, the Home Office, doing all of this to make sure he stuck to reality. His interest in reality went so far that he didn't employ famous actors. Again, that's another similarity with Threads. They employed unknown faces at the time. They wanted ordinary people to stress that this is what would happen to your neighbour in the street, your friends, your colleagues. So the war game had the same approach. They didn't recruit any big name actors. They recruited instead from various amateur dramatic societies in Kent. No big names, no one overshadowing it, just ordinary folk, the same people who would be subject to this horror if nuclear war ever happened. And then of course, over the dramatic scenes we have the documentary style filming, which is narrated by Michael Aspel, giving it the newsreader feel, giving it that dose of authenticity. And we also cut away at points to hear quotes from experts, men in white coats, scholars and scientists, religious folk. So we've got this mix, this sharp blend of reality and drama to give us the truth of nuclear war. Now, of course, the Home Office weren't happy about the public having the truth about nuclear war, and neither were some people in the BBC. So when the war game was finally presented to those men in suits at the higher levels of the BBC, they were not happy, and the thing was banned. Even though it had got as far as having a provisional date for broadcast, it was pulled. The Director General of the BBC at the time, Hugh Green, wrote that even with a late night showing and suitable warning, one cannot guarantee that there would not be children, the very old, or the unbalanced in the audience who might be seriously disturbed. And so the whole thing was declared to be, quote, too horrifying for the medium of broadcasting. Peter Watkins later said that he'd been told the BBC feared waves of panic and some suicides if this film was broadcast. And so to be on the safe side, to safeguard the peace of mind and mental health of the population, the film was banned. That's one way of looking at it. Another way is to say that the Home Office perhaps exerted pressure on the BBC and said, we don't want this shown, you will withdraw it. The BBC deny that, of course, they've always denied it, but the argument is there that pressure was exerted from the government to take this film off the screen. And many protesters have long suspected that the BBC gave in to pressure from government. So the film was not going to be shown on TV as originally planned. However, the BBC did permit it to be shown at the National Film Theatre in 4 special screenings. Now, the general public weren't allowed to go along. These special screenings were shown to a specially invited audience of politicians, BBC staff and people in civil defence. The general public were kept out, and the film was delivered under police guard. That's how worried the BBC were about the huge controversy already being whipped up about this film. So you weren't allowed to see it in Britain unless you were one of the fancy people invited to those 4 special screenings. Although it was later released to various film clubs across the country. I've heard of CND groups in universities getting a hold of it and showing it to their groups on campus. So it was seen by some ordinary folk, but there was no mass viewing of it as would have happened if it had gone out on the BBC with everyone across the country sitting down to watch it at the same time. These days, of course, we all watch TV differently. We all watch TV on catch-up or we watch it online. There's very rarely a moment, except I suppose, with things like the World Cup recently, there's very rarely a moment when we all sit down at the same time and watch one thing and then go into work the next day and say, oh my god, did you see that last night? That rarely happens these days, but back in the 60s when this would have been broadcast, we would have, I assume, have had that huge effect. Most of the population, or many at least, would have been watching it together and talking about it the next day and sharing the experience, and then it would have spread through word of mouth. It was denied that because the BBC banned it. You could see it if you lived abroad though. It was allowed to be shown in various foreign cinemas, so it was out there. It's just the poor old British public were denied it. But you could see it in a foreign cinema, and it was so well received abroad that it went on to win an Oscar. It won an Oscar for Best Documentary. So a great film, powerful film, bringing the truth of nuclear war, celebrated by everyone who saw it, awarded the highest award, an Oscar for Best Documentary. But the BBC said, nah, the British public, they're not seeing it, no. And as I said at the beginning of the podcast, they didn't rectify that huge error until 1985, when it was finally broadcast on BBC Two, I believe. So let's look at the reception the film had in Britain amongst those select few who were allowed to see it. Well, the leader of the Women's Royal Voluntary Service wasn't happy with it. Of course, as we said at the beginning, her organisation got a bit of an insult in the film, with the implication that they'd be on hand with their apple pies and custards, roast beef and Brussels sprouts after the nuclear holocaust. So she wasn't happy. Lady Reading, the chairwoman, she wasn't happy, and she wrote a letter to the Times saying that it's correct, the film should not be shown. She said it wasn't accurate or truthful, and she said, quote, "It paints a false picture which can only mislead the public. If the argument is that the film should be shown in the interest of truth, then let us have all the truth, not only the certainty of enormous destruction and loss of life, but the equal certainty that with efficient national preparation, many millions of lives could be saved." So she was sticking to the story that, yes, there would be millions dead in a nuclear war, but for the millions to survive, if they plan and prepare and are obedient, they'll be okay, which I just can't accept. I've never been able to accept that. Because Britain is so small and so jam-packed with targets. As the war game shows at the very beginning of the film, the very first image on screen is a map of Britain with every city targeted, and then with every military target also highlighted. And once you have a black dot across Britain for every single target, civilian and military, most of the country disappears under these black dots. And of course, once you add in all the fallout from that, the fallout presumably is going to spread into the areas which aren't touched. So no, I don't accept that those who survive the initial blast will be okay. Because the initial blast is only stage one, of course, of the horror. Then comes the fallout, of course, but also the starvation, the radiation sickness, the spread of disease, violence by other people who are battling with you to grab what's left of the tiny amount of food and shelter. No, I don't see at all that the survivors will be tickety-boo as long as they get past the initial blast wave. I don't accept that. But that was her point of view, which of course we must respect. I just don't agree with it. She said there will be enormous destruction, but equally there will be plenty of survivors, and with preparation those survivors will be saved. Perhaps I'm just being horribly pessimistic, but I agree with the quote which appears in the war game, that the survivors will envy the dead. So that was a letter to the Times. The Daily Express, 1966, they weren't happy with the film either. They called it, I assume they went to one of the screenings at the National Film Theatre, they called it, quote, "so super horrific it could not possibly be shown on television." And the critic went on to call it biased and repulsive, and he said it was little more than CND propaganda. The Guardian reviewed it in February 1966. They weren't bowled over by it. They found it to be, quote, "a strange mixture of the very good and the very bad." They said the very good parts are the portrayal of the aftermath of a thermonuclear bombing, but they say, quote, "the weakness of the film is the argument which accompanies the dramatisation of nuclear war. It is on a very low level. Mr. Watkins is admirably gifted and can project the evidence about what would follow in real and human terms from a nuclear burst. But on how we avoid these horrors, he is not only simple-minded, but abusive and propagandistic." So that's the left-wing Guardian saying that the film does veer towards propaganda. The Guardian also criticised the BBC for banning the film. To quote from the article, "The inevitable horrors have apparently been the reason for the BBC's objections, which are comprehensible but not really defensible. We should know about our world." Well, those were some of the reviews from the 60s. What happened when it was finally shown in the BBC 20 years later? Well, The Guardian had changed their mind. By 1985, Nancy Banks Smith reviewed it, and she loved it. She speaks of the horrible moment when there's a wee boy in his back garden who looks up at the flash, and we're told that, well, the implication is that his eyeballs have melted. And she says, like the flash, the war game was, so to speak, too brilliant to look at. She goes on to say, "It is a masterpiece. It doesn't wear well, it wears better. Made before the curse of colour, those magnificently ordinary faces still draw their breath in pain and speak to us stammering. They look, if anything, backward to the Blitz rather than forward to some imaginary atomic war. The last war had, after all, only been over 20 years. 20 years on, the look of the thing is enough to melt the eyeball in tears. Now, you'll notice that this podcast is a longer version. Normally they're about 20 minutes long, I suppose, on average. This one is longer because I won't be able to do one next week because I do these podcasts every Sunday. I'm getting married on the following Sunday. So, we're going away to get married, so I won't be at home. So I won't be able to do a podcast. So I'm sorry about that, of course, especially to my patrons who contribute money towards this podcast. So there won't be one next Sunday. I've just got too much to... I haven't even written my wedding vows yet. The only thing I have done, I think, is pick some nice shoes. So I've got some nice shoes, but there's still a million other things to be arranged. So there won't be one next Sunday. So here is an extended version to make up for that. And I'll do a nice extended one on the following Sunday. So hopefully you'll excuse me skipping 1 week. So extended version here, and there will be one not next Sunday but the next. My patrons will be getting one of their rewards. Some of them have signed up for the reward where you get a postcard from nuclear sites that I visit. I'm going to send them all one from Blackpool, which is where I'm going to get married, because I'm not going to visit a bunker or anything. I wouldn't get married in a nuclear bunker. You can do that, but the idea doesn't appeal to me. I find it quite insulting almost to, the horror of makes the thing a bit trivial to be gadding around in a nuclear bunker in your wedding dress. No. The idea crossed my mind, for a millisecond. Would that be quite cool? And then I thought, no, I'm not doing that. So, not getting married in a nuclear bunker, not going to any particular nuclear site, but the hotel we're getting married at has a very vague nuclear war role. I think I mentioned this last week in last week's podcast. I won't go over it again. But my patrons, look out for a postcard next week from Blackpool, from an area which has a slight nuclear connection. And let me thank my patrons. They donate money each month to this podcast to help keep it going. So we all owe them some thanks. Let's thank Angus McClellan, Ben Capper, Brian Outlaw, Claire Brennan, Colin McGee, Gordy McNair, Jonathan Abelins, Kieran Taylor, Mary Freer, Paul Jonathan Viner, Paul Maxwell Walters, Peter Lee, Peter Mars, Phil Catling, Richard Grundy, Sarah Williams, Sean Judge, Sean Milson, Steve Sace, and Wyn Grant. Thank you, everyone. And given that I'm doing another extended episode when I get back from the wedding, by all means tweet me some ideas if there's anything in particular you'd like to see covered. You can tweet me, find me on Twitter at Julie A. McDowell, or get me on Facebook at my nuclear page, which is Nuclear Britain, or get me through my website, which is juliemcdowell.com. I'm always open to ideas, as long as the idea is not too crazy, as long as I've got actual research material that I can work from. So that's us for this week. A reminder that the war game is on Iplayer for another couple of weeks at least, if you want to watch it. Of course, it's freely available on DVD, you can buy it easily. Of course, the ultimate nuclear war film, Threads, that's never been uploaded to Iplayer. That would be a very bold move from the BBC. That would be very brave, very noble of them. I have had a few wee Twitter campaigns trying to get them to do it, retweet if you want Threads shown, and we got hundreds and hundreds of retweets, but I suppose that's not enough to make a dent on the BBC. We would need thousands, but feel free to tweet them asking for Threads to be shown. If they've uploaded the war game, then why on earth not do it with Threads? I fully believe that Threads is the best thing the BBC's ever done, the most powerful film they've ever made. It seems like a waste to keep it concealed. Why not put it out there? Why not introduce a whole new generation to it? So I suppose you can make your voice heard through Twitter. You can tweet them about that if you want to join our wee campaign to get Threads back on. But perhaps it's just a bit too much. Perhaps Threads is just too dreadful, too powerful. I don't know. But they can't deny that this topic is relevant again. Everyone is once again interested in the nuclear threat. And of course, a new generation are discovering it again thanks to Trump, etc. And the BBC's responsibility is to inform, educate and entertain. Threads doesn't entertain, it's too horrific for that, but it certainly does inform and educate. So I think they should be showing it. Maybe they will. Maybe if they've put the war game up, Threads will follow, who knows. But do catch the war game while it's still available on Iplayer. And that's us for this week. I need to go off now and prepare for this wedding. But thank you for listening. I hope you've liked this extended episode. There won't be one next week, but I've got a good excuse, haven't I? You only get married once, hopefully. And we'll do an extended episode the week after. So I'll see you all then. Thanks for listening. Bye now.